United States, and that is a pressure upon the government to begin to address the question of racism in America. Okay, however, the Cold War has propels the civil rights movement in the international sphere. It forces the government to address the issue of Negro oppression and lynchings especially, but it also sets back the civil rights movement, because to criticize American society is to be threatened with a witch hunt because of the Red Scare and produced by the Cold War. So in many ways, the civil rights movement goes underground. It goes from attempts at strikes and marches on Washington during World War II to, during the early 50s, a struggle in the courts by the NAACP around Brown versus Board of Education. Are you all with me? Because it was more respectable to fight in the era of Red Scare and Cold War in the courts. And fighting in the streets meant that you might be called a communist and might be imprisoned. But this migration of Black Americans from countryside to city creates a Black middle class, of which Martin Luther King is a part. A different Black middle class in the cities, ministers and teachers, that has different interests from the old longstanding Black middle class. And it's that new Black working class and Black middle class in the cities of the South that leads the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, for example, that Martin Luther King. So there are complex forces that are leading to the 1960s, which is the subject of this conversation. Okay, so don't have time to go into how was it that then the civil rights movement was reignited in the mid-1950s. Certainly the death of Emmett Till had something to do with it. The Montgomery bus boycott for sure. That's a conversation for a different period, but let's get into the 60s. And what is the significance of this decade? It is the decade that produced a series of social movements among the most important of the 20th century. The most recognized of these movements is, of course, the civil rights movement, which ended racial segregation and challenged racism. How? By humanizing the descendants of the slaves in the United States, of enslaved Africans. But the civil rights movement also inspired the movement for Black power, for women's rights and gay and lesbian liberation, a prisoners' rights movement. It inspired a movement against poverty, against the Vietnam War, against environmental degradation. And it also inspired movements among other historically oppressed groups, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Asians. And collectively, the 60s is important because these movements radically changed the relationship between white people and people of color in the United States. It challenged the country's assumptions about gender and sexuality, challenged heteronormativity, but also how the United States conducts foreign policy. Huge. The anti-war movement was massive. It was an anti-imperialist movement that in the middle of the Cold War criticized US foreign policy and impugned it and exposed it for imposing the will of US empire on the Vietnamese. One of the organizations of this period that emerged in the late 60s is the Young Lords. And all of these movements, by the way, form part of what is known as the New Left, a new movement that distinguishes itself from the old left, the left of the 1930s. So one of these organizations is the Young Lords, and the Young Lords are part of the New Left, right? It was the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. In its first incarnation, the Young Lords was a gang in Chicago of mostly Mexican and Puerto Rican youth that emerges in 1959, really a street organization that was transformed into a political organization by its leader, Jose Chacha Jimenez, in collaboration with other activists, leftists, communists, but also the intervention of Fred Hampton, the leader of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. So there's a transformation of a street organization, a gang, into political revolutionary organization. That transformation is a Herculean one. It takes a Herculean effort. It's led by Jose Chacha Jimenez, the gang leader. And I tell that transformation, which is epic, in the first chapter of the book. The organization then spreads to New York, where it was led from the start by a cohort of very talented, poor and working class youth, the first in their families to attend college, mostly Puerto Ricans who grew up in neighborhoods like the South Bronx and East Harlem in New York. But all of these young people are students. They're the first in their families to attend college. They are not associated with street life and with gang life. They were radicalized by the civil rights and Black Power movements, the Vietnam War, but also the beginnings of struggles in the university for ethnic studies, African-American history, and the struggle to civilize the curriculum in the university, to the struggle to make the curriculum reflect the history of the world, not just the history and literature of Europe. So the Young Lords form part of a generation of socialist youth that made it their priority to make revolution here in the United States, but also on the island of Puerto Rico. And the Young Lords, like the Black Panthers, are important because they popularized socialist ideas in the communities where they were active, in East Harlem, in the Lower East Side, in Philadelphia, where they were active, in Chicago, in the South Bronx. They form part of a generation that saw war and imperialism abroad, racism and class inequality at home, and suffering the world over, and joined the fight for human liberation. And the Young Lords' understanding of who they were in relation to the United States, to the nation, drove their project. So this is a quintessential and existential question: who am I? Right? That question, who am I? And who am I in relation to the nation, drove their project. They learned in the process of reading, of having socialist study sessions like this, they learned that the island of Puerto Rico was the oldest colony in the world, colonized by the Spaniards in 1508, and then recolonized again by the United States in 1898. And in this process, they discovered that the nature of US interests in Puerto Rico, like why was the United States in Puerto Rico? They realized that the nature of US imperialism in Puerto Rico was geostrategic, and that over the course of the 20th century, the United States had launched all of its military interventions in Latin America from military bases in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was also important to the United States because it was the place where the United States tested and developed the blueprint for capitalist development and expansion in so-called third world economies during the Cold War. So capitalism is distinguished by its need to expand, right? What's at the core of the capitalist system? Among other things, capitalism is inherently expansionistic. Why? Because through expansion, capitalism overcomes its tendency to fall into crises of overaccumulation and overproduction, meaning that the system produces more goods than it can absorb. And so it overcomes this tendency toward overproduction, which is a crisis, which is what led to the recession of 2008, but also to the Great Depression. It resolves this crisis of overproduction through expansion. And so during the Cold War, expansion, capitalist expansion, was the object of US empire. And it was in Puerto Rico that US empire tested what that expansion into third world countries might look like, how to crowbar capitalism into a rural country like Puerto Rico or Vietnam, for that matter. How did it do that? In 1947, that project, that testing project, an industrialization project of the island, was launched, known as Operation Bootstrap. And it displaced more farmers than it absorbed into the economy. So the United States launches Operation Bootstrap in 1947 on the island of Puerto Rico. And the project's contingency plan, because it knew that it was going to create more unemployment than employment, its contingency plan encouraged the mass transfer of Puerto Ricans from the island to cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. A third of the people of the island of Puerto Rico were displaced by Operation Bootstrap. Think about it. A third of the people of the island were displaced. That is a gutting of a country. So this is what the young lords discover as they are becoming socialist and they're being radicalized during the 60s. They come to understand why their parents were here, and they realize that they are the children of poor peasants who migrated to cities like New York and Chicago as a result of Puerto Rican of Operation Bootstrap in Puerto Rico. So they were the children of the mass migration of Puerto Ricans who had been massively displaced by US policy on the island in the era of the Cold War. And so this was very important. The young lords were very popular. They were popular in part because they helped their generation articulate this existential crisis of who am I in relation to the nation? And why were our parents massively displaced? Upon arrival here in the United States, Puerto Ricans, like Black Americans who were migrating to New York and to Chicago begin to experience another kind of displacement. And that's the rise of deindustrialization. The fact that it's after World War II that, that American factories begin to leave the cities to the suburbs, the South, and abroad in stages. So today we tend to think about deindustrialization as something that affects white workers, but before it disemboweled white communities around the country in the 1980s and 90s, it eviscerated urban centers where poor people of color were settling and were coming as migrants for the first time, seeking low-wage jobs. And there's a crisis of deindustrialization, which leads to permanent unemployment for the first time in the history of the city. Not of the city here in the United States, New York, Chicago, in the history of the city, in the history of humanity. Cities have always produced jobs. And now in the city, the Bureau of Labor Statistics was realizing that there were these pockets of young people who were permanently unemployed, had been permanently unemployed, and had stopped looking for employment because they had given up, because they tried and they couldn't find employment. And this is part of what I studied and part of what the book discusses. It's not just a history of the Young Lords, it's a history of the political economy of the city and the relationship between the politics of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and the emerging urban crisis, right? So part of what I argue is that it is no surprise that the Black Panthers and the Young Lords identify the lumpen proletariat as the most revolutionary class in society, a departure from classical Marxism, precisely at the moment when the city is producing for the first time a class of permanent unemployed young people. And that identification of the lumpen proletariat also connects with the new revolutionary movements across the world against European imperialism and colonization that are led by peasants and not workers in places like Algeria, in Cuba, and beyond. So displacement becomes a big part of the politics of late 60s radicals in the city, addressing deindustrialization, permanent unemployment, but also the fallout and an enormous amount of drug addiction. So the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, they turned to these programs that addressed addiction at the level of the community. And in New York, here at Lincoln Hospital, they developed the first drug treatment center to use acupuncture to treat people who were having problems with drugs. Another issue that they called attention to, but that also propelled the Northern civil rights and Black Power movement, was urban renewal, which is that era's version of gentrification. It's a lot more complicated than that, but I don't have time to go into it. There was also dilapidated housing, police brutality, the super exploitation in the city of garment industry workers. 70% of the Puerto Rican community the Puerto Rican working class worked in these garment factories. And so part of what the Young Lords addressed and fought against was the attempt on the part of the city to strip the super exploited class of Puerto Ricans of their dignity. They also exposed the unforgiving condition of colonization in Puerto Rico. And they called attention to to Vietnam and made a connection between Vietnam and Puerto Rico as colonies, or attempts at colonization of Vietnam, much like the United States had colonized Puerto Rico. And in the process of addressing these issues of unemployment, police brutality, horrific housing conditions, all of this is something that sociologists later called the urban crisis. But radicals, socialist radicals in urban centers like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers were already theorizing the emergence of permanent unemployment and automation, the automation of industry that was also creating problems in the community, in the city. In this process of fighting against racism, but also against issues of class import, they made common cause with Black Americans and made it a priority to establish common cause with Black Americans. Okay, so on the ground, what did the Young Lords do? They launched militant and dramatic community-based campaigns. In Chicago, they worked around issues of urban renewal. In New York, they engaged in militant community organizing around medical discrimination in the area of health in the hospitals. They also blocked traffic with neighborhood garbage to protest poor sanitation conditions. They exposed childhood lead poisoning. They took over a hospital, Lincoln Hospital, and they drafted the first known patient Bill of Rights. And they're credited by the Journal of Public Health with the passage, their activism and militancy, the fact that they occupied the office of the Department of Health, and they went door to door testing children for lead poisoning and discovered that 30% of the children they tested were lead positive. And then they held a series of press conferences exposing and shaming the city. And asking, would this happen to white children? So all of the activism they did around lead poisoning led the Journal of Public Health to say that, to credit them with the passage of anti-lead poisoning legislation in New York in 1970. They are also famous for occupying an East Harlem church and turning it into a social service sanctuary for the poor, where they established a free breakfast program for children in the image of the breakfast program established by the Black Panther Party. But they also established a socialist school, which was one of the most controversial things they did. Interestingly enough, it was the socialist school in the church that drew an enormous amount of vitriol from the city. And what's interesting about the Young Lords is that they called all of their campaigns offensives in solidarity with the Tet Offensive of the Vietnamese in 1968. So they called their garbage campaign the Garbage Offensive, the Lead Offensive, the Lincoln Offensive, the Church Offensive. And you might know that the Tet Offensive was the most important military campaign of the Vietnam War, because it was during the Tet Offensive that the Vietnamese decided to attack Americans in the cities rather than in the jungle, as had happened previously. And it was a surprise attack that happened during the Vietnamese New Year. I want to clarify that the Young Lords were both community organizers who were building a movement, but they were also revolutionary socialists and revolutionary nationalists building a revolutionary project. That is something that is rarely seen in American history, that socialists are building a movement and organizing at the level of the community, but also building a revolutionary organization. So they were revolutionaries who were combining the idea of building a broad movement with the notion of building a revolutionary party. And that is why they were beloved and celebrated in the 60s. And they were doing this, and the young lords, I argue in the book, are the best kept secret of the 1960s, because they accomplished more probably than any of the other organizations of the New Left. They emerged in 1969 at a moment when 2 million students polled in the United States said that they believed in the importance of building a revolutionary party. So that gives you a sense of the massive shift in consciousness of the late 60s, wherein system overthrow and challenges to capitalism and proposals for a revolutionary socialist alternative were in the air, in the conversation. They called themselves Marxist-Leninists, and they were influenced by the Cuban Revolution. They also were revolutionary nationalists because they championed the independence of Puerto Rico. They published a newspaper which they called Palante, which means forward in struggle. They developed a 13-point program and platform, much like the Black Panthers. And the first point of their platform read, "We want self-determination for Puerto Ricans, liberation on the island and in the United States." So the colonial question was critical to their brand of revolutionary socialism. And the final point of their platform, number 13, read, "We want a socialist society." Okay, so I know that we should probably, I don't know how long I should be speaking for. Can someone tell me?
Sure, so we have until 8:30.
Okay, so let me try to wrap up quickly so that we can maybe open it up for questions.
Yes, your call. You're in charge.
So they were influenced by what is known as third world socialism, the fight against European colonialism and the anti-colonial struggle married with the struggle for a socialist society. Solidarity was at the core of the idea of third world socialism. They were influenced by a cross-section of ideas, theories coming out of this decolonization struggle in Asia and Africa. They were clearly influenced by the ideas of Mao Zedong. Writers like Frantz Fanon, who wrote Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Masks. But ultimately, I think this is important for, given that this is a socialist, school, night school. They believe that society should be organized around human need, not on the basis of profit as under capitalism. And that workers and ordinary people could democratically reorganize society and run it in the interest of the many. So they were not democratic socialists. They were revolutionary socialists. Democratic socialists usually identify the electoral realm as a center of struggle. And they argue that socialism can be won through the electoral process. Revolutionary socialists and Leninists argue that that's impossible, that a revolution has to happen because capitalism controls the state, and that the state has to be overthrown in the revolutionary process, and that the working class and its self-activity through strikes and the mass strike leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I'm telling you these things because I want to challenge you all. the DSA folks and this notion of the revolutionary, the electoral road to socialism. So they emphasize that class conflict is central and universal in the fight to solve society's problems. In other words, that the world is divided between the poor and the rich, that working class people produce all the goods and services in society, but that the rich and their governments own and control the means of production and how those goods are distributed and what the priorities of society are. And they argued that only a revolution could resolve this fundamental conflict and class inequality. Therefore, they decried conservative and cultural forms of nationalism, which called for unity on the basis of race or ethnicity alone, as in the example of declaring Puerto Rican independence in order to build Puerto Rican capitalism. A recognizable analogy might be today nationalist calls among Black people to buy Black. The Black Panthers also called cultural nationalists pork chop nationalists and lambasted them for being more concerned with making money selling dashikis than with real revolution and liberation of oppressed people. Like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords knew that they couldn't pull off a revolution or even short-term reforms on their own, and therefore they sought to build coalitions with other political formations. And because of their class politics, they advocated coalitions with racially diverse groups on the basis of shared class interests. So it was Fred Hampton who called for the Rainbow Coalition. For the Young Lords, who were Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, the Black Panthers, the descendants of enslaved Africans, but also the Young Patriots, poor whites from Appalachia in Chicago, to come together on the basis of shared class interests. And it's important to say that when Fred Hampton started talking about the haves and the have-nots, that he was targeted and executed in Chicago by the state. Okay, the Young Lords did an enormous amount of work around issues of health. They occupied a hospital. They drafted alongside of doctors, healthcare workers, non-medical, like the folks who clean the hospital. Everyone in the hospital, they organized them, and they had this patient complaint table that also got the patients involved in organizing in the hospital. They occupied the hospital to dramatize the horrific conditions of health under which Puerto Ricans and Black Americans were being, were getting health care or not. And they drafted the first patient Bill of Rights with this coalition that was known as the Think Lincoln Committee. It is an incredible story. I do not have time to talk about this, but I dedicate at least 2 chapters of the book to all of the work they did around health and medical discrimination. But this is what I'm going to end with. They pressured the hospital administration at Lincoln Hospital to consent to a public hearing, because Lincoln Hospital was the site of the first abortion death after the passage of abortion law in New York State before Roe v. Wade in 1973. And they pressured the hospital to consent to a public hearing where doctors would explain the circumstances leading to the death of Carmen Rodriguez, where questions and counter questions would be heard. And essentially what happened was that an intern performed the abortion and didn't check the record. And she had a heart problem, and the intern administered a saline abortion, which is deadly for someone with a heart condition and known. So it was out of the struggle that they draft the first Patient Bill of Rights, which says that healthcare is a right and not a privilege, that poor patients in public hospitals should not be subjected to observation and care by medical students without the prior consent of the patient and without strict supervision from superiors. They demanded that doctors explain patients their medical condition. This is new. This is something that we take for granted, but this struggle and this Patient Bill of Rights was what raised these issues and mainstreamed them. That doctors should look a patient in the face, a Black and Puerto Rican patient, introduce themselves and call them by their last name, Ms. Fernandez or Ms. Santiago or Mr. Smith. Again, the medical profession was totally unreconstructed, and this is what they brought to the 60s, among many other things. But this is how I'm going to end. There was an enormous amount of talk about how Black and brown people were more likely to become severely ill from COVID-19 due to the high rates of underlying or pre-existing medical conditions among Black Americans and Latinos in the United States. And the mainstream discussion of this phenomenon was tinged with race ideology, the distorted notion that Black and brown people in the United States are biologically predisposed to illness because of race. Distorted notion, race as a biological category does not exist. What is important about the 60s and the Young Lords, among many things, is that the Young Lords were more accurately defining pre-existing medical conditions in the 60s as diseases of poverty. This was a term they adopted from the Cubans, who built the most successful healthcare system in the world that's celebrated even today. And they linked high mortality rates among people of color to the life and death hazards of care in the city's dilapidated public hospitals, which, by the way, was what the New York Times told us in the summer, in July. The New York Times published an article saying, well, it seems that what determined whether you lived or died was where you landed in a hospital. If you landed in a ruling class hospital, you were gonna die. You were gonna live. If you landed in a poor hospital in the Bronx, you were gonna die. And they also adopted, they also argued that that these pervasive diseases of poverty had nothing to do with race and everything to do with structural displacement, with the hardship and stress of working and living conditions, bad nutrition, which produced diabetes and hypertension. Part of what I do in the book is that I ask the question, how the hell did all of these young people end up doing so much work around issues of health? Like, why issues of health? Fascinating story that I do not have time to discuss, but part of what I argue is that the Young Lords were translators for their parents in hospitals and schools and at police precincts and at banks. And as the translators for their parents, they became radicalized by the poor treatment their parents received at a moment when you were most vulnerable and most human, when you're ill. And part of what I discovered was the writing of Mindy Thompson Fullilove. And part of what she argues is that social displacement produces root shock. And this post-war period was an enormous moment of displacement and therefore root shock. So poor people of color, working class, who landed in the city were disproportionately ill because root shock, displacement, deindustrialization, urban renewal, which displaced people of color from their housing, She says, Dr. Mindy Fullilove, a social psychiatrist, that root shock undermines trust, increases anxiety, destabilizes relationships, destroys social, emotional, and financial resources, and increases the risk of every kind of stress-related disease, from depression to heart attack. And it's a fascinating story of the political economy of the city, its changes, how disease becomes more prevalent, but also the reorganization of the health industry by what the young lords called medical empires. Medical schools like Columbia University, NYU, that end up having a huge influence on how medical care is organized in the United States. I will just say that one of the beautiful things that the young lords argued, and I'll end here, is that they decided to address issues of health. Because again, it's when we're most vulnerable at the moment when we are face to face with mortality, that we are most human, and that the possibility for solidarity is greatest. And what is a shame about this country is that most human societies have paid an enormous amount of respect to this question of mortality and the dead, right? That's what anthropologists say distinguishes us from animals, that we revere the dead. And that's a kind of abstract thinking that is human, right? This fear of mortality. And in this era of pandemic, the wealthiest country in the world has forsaken life across the board. And that is really just a reflection of the deep political and economic crisis in which capitalism and US hegemony finds itself.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. We're going to go to questions. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box and I will read it. I just want to give a brief note about Democratic Socialists of America in the year of 2021. We consider ourselves to be a multi-tendency organization, and there are members of DSA who identify as Marxist-Leninist, as well as people who ascribe to more sort of traditionally social democratic politics, as well as even anarchist. So we are a multi-tendency organization, but it is true that DSA does do electoral work. One of the question I want to start with is from Morgan, who wants to know if the Young Lords are still active today and where do they stand today?
So thank you, Morgan, for that question. So the Young Lords, like the Black Panthers, are products of the period, right? They emerge there. It's a revolutionary organization that emerges out of the conditions of the post-war period, the urban crisis. And it was destroyed by the counterintelligence program of the FBI, the COINTELPRO, much like the New Left. And so the Young Lords ended just with collapse in 1973, 74. And I tell that story, which is horrific, in the last chapter of the book, which is not just about the Young Lords, but what happened to the movements of the 60s.
So another question someone has asked, I believe Kara, can you also discuss the Women's Caucus and their role in helping to define intersectional feminism?
Okay, so so they didn't call it intersectional. In fact, they were a lot clearer, because intersectional politics kind of gives everything an equal weight. But part of what the Young Lords and other feminists of the period did was that they tied patriarchy to the rise of class society before capitalism, and argued that that the overthrow of class society was critical to the overthrow of patriarchy. So they, the socialist feminists of the period were arguing that in hunter-gatherer societies, men and women had fairly equal roles, and that women went on the hunt as much as men. All of which is, we were learning about even more these days. This has been in the news of late, especially in November. There were some grave sites in Peru where 27 out of the 40 some odd warriors in this grave site, 29 were women, not 27. Anyway, so the struggle in the organization was phenomenal around issues of gender. First of all, it started, again, Marxists. What are the material conditions that make possible struggle and struggle that can win? There were women in the organization from the beginning, but they were outnumbered by the men. After the church occupation, this was the big militant event or action of the Young Lords that garnered an enormous amount of attention. Women joined the organization in large numbers and became approximately 40% of the organization after the church occupation. And immediately they started meeting on Sundays, and they told the men that they were going to meet. And the men were like, yeah, go have your little hen meetings. We don't care. And the women also started writing articles on issues of gender oppression, the relationship between colonization and patriarchy and women's oppression. And also, what does women's oppression look like for women of color? So they essentially established that women of color were perceived to be sexual objects by the white establishment, but they were also workers, disproportionately workers. They also theorized gender as pertains Black and Latino men who were perceived as and depicted as sexual predators, right? The notion that Black men rape women. They theorized all of this work in the newspaper. Continued to meet. They started challenging the leadership, and they drafted a 10-point document demanding equality between the sexes. It was a struggle. They wanted to be able to be part of the defense ministry, by the way. That was one of the things that they argued, that we should be part of the defense ministry, which meant that they should be in equal numbers trained in martial arts as the Young Lords and the Black Panthers were trained for security purposes. And the men actually said, okay, we're going to train you, and really hurt them as a form of backlash in the training. But eventually they won, and part of what they proposed was for the organization to establish male and female women's and men's caucuses to discuss issues of gender oppression that were very difficult to address and talk about. They also attempted to establish a gay caucus, and Sylvia Rodriguez was not a member of the Young Lords, but was asked the Young Lords to provide her with security and there was a friendly relationship between them.
Could you explain who Sylvia Rodriguez was, people who might not know?
Sylvia, it's not Rodriguez, it's Sylvia. Can someone remind me? Sylvia. So she's a very important transgender activist, Puerto Rican transgender activist of the period in New York City.
I think it's Sylvia Rivera.
Rivera, sorry, Lord Jesus. Sylvia Rodriguez. Sylvia Rivera. I'm thinking of Sylvia Federici, who's also a very important
Taliban and the Witch.
Yes, the Taliban and the Witch, phenomenal on the rise of capitalism and the witch hunts, the relationship between the witch hunts and the rise of capitalism. Anyway, so what's important is that I don't know that any other New Left formation address the issue of patriarchy and sexual oppression, or gender oppression, not sexual oppression, gender oppression as thoroughly, attempted to as thoroughly as the Young Lords did through the formation structurally of these caucuses to address these issues. And what ends up happening is that rules emerge on how these issues are going to be dealt with in the organization.
Sure. So
and people get disciplined around these issues.
I want to again remind people that if you have a question, please put it in the question and answer box. If you put it in the regular chat, I might not see it. I see some questions in the chat and they're very good questions. I don't want to miss them. An anonymous attendee asks, what do you think we can learn from the Young Lords as an organizational model and on how to build toward revolution and socialism in the United States?
Okay, also I want to say before I move to that question that what they won, the women, was the election of a woman to the official leadership body of the organization, the Central Committee. So Denise Oliver, who's Black American, by the way, not Puerto Rican, was elected to the leadership body of the organization. And the Young Lords are fascinating because they're very ethnically diverse. So approximately a third of the organization is composed of Black Americans, and another like 5% composed of non-Puerto Rican Latinos. So it was a Puerto Rican revolutionary nationalist organization that had a very open culture and that sought common cause with Black Americans, poor people, poor racially oppressed people. So the question was, again, sorry.
Question was, what can we learn from the Young Lords as an organizational model on how to build toward revolution and socialism in the US today?
Well, organization and discipline, important, very important. So I think that I have a list here of things that I like to reference because I forget. So again, the importance of the Young Lords and the reason why they won was because they married an evangelical commitment to organizing at the level of the community on the ground with the project of building a disciplined revolutionary organization. So all organizing, all movements begin with local struggle, and they were committed to local struggle. They were committed to political education, right? So people didn't join the Young Lords understanding even what socialism was. In fact, many young people who joined the organization couldn't read and write, and they describe how they learned how to read and write in the Young Lords. They became autodidacts, and interestingly enough, the women of the Young Lords engaged in this kind of literacy work. They had a structural analysis of social problems, which meant that that they identify root causes of social problems. This is why left groups are critical, which meant that they also said that these problems are structural. We're going to have to engage in militant direct action and grassroots organizing to paralyze business as usual. So they identified an issue in conversation with the community, but they also developed a strategy for how to stop business as usual and force the city to answer. They also worked with other, they tried to establish coalitions with individuals in the hospital, with doctors, and it wasn't easy, with the workers in the hospital. They organized the non-medical workers in Lincoln and in other, they joined with them and actually recommended that they form their own organization, which they called ATRUM, the Health Revolutionary Unity Movement, named after the Dodge Revolutionary Unity Movement in Detroit. The Black workers in Detroit that organized at the point of production in the automobile industry. DRUM, that's like one of the revolutionary groups of the period, Marxist, that you should, more traditionally Marxist, that you should know about. They married bold, direct action that paralyzed institutions like the health department, but also they occupied a hospital and a church with a media strategy. And the purpose was to shift the terms of political debate and dominate the narrative. And they didn't do one press conference. The Young Lords actually popularized this press conference within the New Left. They had a press conference every day. Like Cuomo had a press conference every day. The Young Lords had a press conference every day. And I am certain that if the Young Lords had been around, they would have occupied a hospital and they would definitely had had a parallel press conference alongside of Cuomo's and Trump's daily to essentially explain the world and its problems, offer an alternative assessment and analysis of society and its problems, but also solutions. And this, my friends, is very important because white Americans, right, white supremacists have influenced public discourse, in part because the left has not been able to, among other reasons, to leverage its power in this battle in the public square over the ideas that are percolating and the problems of American society. So it's dangerous in a period like this, a proto-fascist period. This is another thing they did. They argued that capitalism plus healthcare equals a human rights catastrophe. Capitalism, healthcare for profit, death. They exploded the contradictions in society by humanizing, by amplifying human stories. So they actually attempted to humanize these issues. They also had a series of publications, right? Literature. They contributed to a publication called Health Pack. Think Lincoln was a publication. Palante, their newspaper. And they believed that this was critical for educating the public and demolishing the prevailing ruling class ideology about the soundness of free market healthcare and capitalism generally. And most importantly, they engaged in what is known as prefigurative politics. They weren't just fighting against something, they were fighting for something. And they attempted to articulate their vision in their protests and campaigns.
So I have a question for you. I'm going to abuse my moderator's privilege and ask you a question that I had when you were talking. What was the role of political education in the Young Lords Party? I know there's a lot of debates on the left right now about whether or not there's any sort of value to political education, or whether or not reading theory like Marx or Lenin is somehow inherently elitist. But then a lot of groups like the Black Panther Party spoke very eloquently about the importance of political education. Obviously, the Communist Party, which organized in Alabama, was, big into political education. What was the role of political education in the Young Lords Party, and what did it look like?
Okay, so the organization, so first of all, they had a Ministry of Education.
Excellent.
So they had a Ministry of Education. They had a Ministry of Finance, they had a Ministry of Defense, they had a Ministry of Health. Juan Gonzalez, who's, you all know Amy Goodman? The co-host, Amy Goodman's co-host, Juan Gonzalez, was a Young Lord. He was one of the founding members of the Young Lords here in New York, and he was the head of the health ministry and of the education ministry at different moments. And what they did was that they established a 13-week study program around each of the 13 points with readings. And everybody had to memorize the 13-point program, by the way. Memorize, to memory, committed to memory. What is it that you believe? What do you stand for? But then you had to read. And reading, I mean, the Young Lords, it was a disciplined paramilitary organization like the Black Panthers. Reading was mandatory for an hour every night. Mandatory. And the organization created a very robust, especially in the beginning, during its first 2 years, I interviewed so many of the members, and they talk about it in the book, by the way. It was like, first of all, the world was on fire. So there was a sense that in order for us to change the world, we have to understand it. And there's all of this literature coming out of Cuba and Algeria, and people are becoming socialists. What does that mean? So there was a very robust culture of political debate, discussion, and disagreement. Because there were folks with different political orientations in the group. But the period encouraged reading, because people were revolutionary socialists, and revolution was in the air. It was actually happening. And when revolution is in the air, the significance of theory becomes manifest. So people want to know what fascism is now. Why? Because there's a fascist in the White House. And so what the hell is fascism, and how did it emerge? And it's socialists, in fact, revolutionary socialists, who've written about fascism and who studied it. And so in moments of crisis, the importance of understanding developments and society, and why crisis and how crisis happens emerges. I mean, I think it's stupid. And it's particular to America, by the way. This we don't, only America, only the American left is talking about, we don't need theory. Only in America. And it has to do with American empire, and it has to do with anti-intellectualism, and it has to do with the fact that if you have no sense of how society works, you're less likely to fight against it and change it, because you're going to be demoralized and you're going to kick down. It's easier to become a white supremacist than a revolutionary socialist. So I mean, I don't even want to talk. I mean, it angers me because education is also liberatory. right? I grew up in the Bronx during the crack epidemic. And if I tell you, you can't even imagine what the public schools look like in the Bronx. So my experience in these ruling class institutions where I landed was fucking liberatory. It was like, oh my God. Like it was personally rich and liberatory. No other way to say it. Like it was there that I read Black women writers, the history of slavery, how capitalism, ideology. I was introduced to ideology in college. Ideology, race ideology. What is ideology? It's our knee-jerk interpretation of the world that we acquire from what Althusser calls the ideological state apparatuses who make us stupid. The church, the media, the family, right? This is how we learn what we think the world, how the world works, through these state institutions. What are they? The church, I don't remember. The family, the media, the school, the schools. And this term ideology, which is one of the most written about subjects in history in the world. More people write about the Russian Revolution, by the way, in ideology than any other subject, for a reason, in history or in the world. This was a term that was used for the first time and identified by Engels and Marx. Ideology, mind blown. I learned about that in college for the first time. Why do girls wear pink and boys blue? Where did that come from? Where does the gender binary come from? Critical. And you know what happens in moments of revolution and social movements? Ideology melts into air. Everything that you thought would never change about the system and how the system is supposed to work goes out the window, and people begin to question society and its norms on a mass scale. But that is a product of the tendency of capitalism to fall into political and economic crisis. So Marxism is a method for understanding what the world looks like today, what are its fissures, and how might we intervene in the context of an analysis of the world as it is today. So it's Marxists, by the way, or materialists who've been saying, kids, fascism is a real thing and it can emerge in the United States. And the president is a fascist. He's a proto-fascist, and that's a problem. And you can't sleep on it because it's, you can't really be a socialist in a fascist state. We are not we don't have a fascist state, right? Because when you have a fascist state, we couldn't have this meeting. Civil society is shut down completely. But you can have fascist currents operating in society, and in the context of economic crisis, without a challenge, they grow, they expand, as we've seen happening. And the best example of that was the Republican convention. I'm not sure if any of you watched, but that was the moment that got all of the mainstream media people stuttering. They didn't know how to handle it. They were like, how is this happening in America? And we were like, well, we told you so.
I appreciate that. As someone who helps to run our political education program, I appreciate you validating what we were doing.
So, yeah.
And I will just say that each of our semesters start with 3 cornerstone programs. One is what is socialism, one is what is Marxism, and one is what is social reproduction theory. And in the Marxist presentation, which you can watch online at our website, which David, we always start with Marxism isn't a platform, it's a method for understanding the world. It's an analytical methodology. So I think all of your points are spot on. So the next question, and we may have time for only 2.
I'll also say that it's also, you won't hear you'll be hard pressed to hear working class revolutionaries talking about we don't need education.
All these people with elite educations who have
It's
education.
the class character of that stupid proposal really exposes the relationship between being and consciousness, by the way. So it's no surprise that in the early 1960s, when students were at the helm of and the Black middle class was at the helm of the civil rights movement, that the major demand was the demand to desegregate the counters at Woolworths, the lunch counters, that the majority of workers couldn't afford. So the demands of that movement reflected the middle class character at that moment of the civil rights movement. That changed. With how did it change? With the riots of 1963 in Birmingham, which led Martin Luther King to call for the package deal. He was like, oh, maybe we need to start calling for jobs and education and healthcare as part of what civil rights means, if we are going to appeal to the mass of Black people in the country, in the South, which we need to win, So let's develop a strategy that addresses their interests. So this is a term. This is like, not a term, but a meme. This is a meme, a Marxist meme. Being determines consciousness. So your class status and your elite education is informing the stupidity of the proposal that education is not important. For those of us who didn't have access to education, we were like, oh yeah, education is quite important. For the slaves for whom reading was a crime, they're like, yeah, no, so please stop it. Stop.
Thank you for that. We have time for, I think, only 1 or 2 more, maybe 2 questions. One of the questions I saw that's quite interesting is, I don't know of any progressive Latino groups who talk about socialism/progressive issues. Are there any groups that you know of that are still around? I feel like Latinos are not often included in progressive issues.
There are, I'm sure they exist, like the People Pueblo Party in New York. There are a bunch of socialists in there. There's another group of Dominicans in the Bronx. I don't know what they're called, but Latin America is the site of socialist discourse in the world, kids, right now. Like, socialism is everywhere dead, but in Latin America. But yes, I think that it has a lot to do with the binary race politics of the United States. It's black and white. However, there is an experience of migration, which informs Latinos, like people whose parents migrated here from Latin America, but they were born here. There's a section in my book called The Crucible of Migration. Migrants are under siege, and because of the American dream, and there's a pressure among immigrants, all immigrants, to go to school, in fact, because that's how you're going to survive and not going to be super exploited like your parents, and become a lawyer or doctor or professor and like keep it straight and narrow. But the DACA students got, you know, a reality check, and the young lords were the children of migration, but they migrated into the civil rights movement, right? So they are the Latinos who are revolutionaries because of the environment in which they emerged politically. But yeah, I'm sure that there are Latinos out there who are, I mean, I'm one of them. I've been a revolutionary for a minute.
So final two questions. I'm gonna lump them together. They're both from Bennett. One of the questions is there a comparable Dominican radical group, or was there overlap with the Young Lords? And the other question from Bennett was, it seems that in the Hispanophone Caribbean, Dominican Republic especially, there's a very tense relationship with Blackness. I'm curious how the Young Lords addressed this and how it was received on the islands.
Who asked that? Absolutely. So my book, everybody go read the book. I promise you that it sings. I spent an enormous amount of time writing this book precisely for those who think that education is not important. It's accessible, but it attempts to raise your theoretical understanding and political understanding of the world. Yes. So one of the things that the Young Lords did and why they're important is because they theorized race in Latin America. How did race ideology emerge under Spanish colonial rule, US imperialism, in a different continent, with a different demographic? So in Latin America, there's an ideology that suggests that a drop of white blood brings you closer to the white ideal. So you want to whiten the race. In the United States, a drop of black blood makes you black. So the Young Lords theorized that. And by the way, this is something that only recently has become in vogue in the university, like in the last 10 years. And the Young Lords were very young, by the way. They were like 14, 15, 16, 17. They were between the ages of 14 and 22. But again, they emerged during this heightened period of struggle and revolutionary politics. So yeah, you know how they addressed it? By exposing it. And interestingly enough, the leadership of the Young Lords was majority Black Latinos. And the organization itself was also majority Black, or disproportionately Black, or more Black than Puerto Rican organizations, and than the Puerto Rican managerial class in New York, which was white Puerto Rican. So race was at the helm. They were Black. They were the Black Puerto Ricans, and they theorized race, and they addressed and the tendency of Puerto Ricans to deny their Blackness, but also their Puerto Ricanness, and the history of race in the Dominican Republic is complex. I'm Dominican, not Puerto Rican, and it has a lot to do with the emergence of the Dominican Republic as a nation. The nation was defined in opposition to Haiti and all things Black. It was a strategy of Dominican nationalism, and it's you know, part of the wages of colonialism and racism. The Young Lords called it colonized mentality. And it's not something particular to race. It's also, they would say, you're thinking that education is not important theory, that's colonized mentality. That's in the interest of the ruling class. So they had a pamphlet, The Ideology of the Young Lords, that talked about these things that that talked about the dialectic, that talked about colonized mentality, race ideology, where it comes from, all kinds of things.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent presentation, and thank you so much to everyone attended. I really appreciate everyone bearing with us through the technical difficulty. David and I were freaking out. We thought we would lose all the participants, but everyone came back. I'm very, very amazed, though I think that speaks to the strength of you, not to David and I, and the topic. So I want to make some announcements about upcoming night schools. First, I'm going to start with non-concrete things and then move into concrete things. We're working on trying to get night schools together on the Haitian Revolution, Black Panther Party, Frantz Fanon, and Eugene Debs. We also have 3 night schools currently scheduled. On January the 18th, we're going to have a night school on ending the war in Yemen, and that is related to the fact that on January 25th, it is the International Day of Action to End the War on Yemen, which at the national level, DSA's Internationalism Committee, which I sit on the steering committee of, has endorsed the International Day of Action to End the War in Yemen. And then David, tell us about our other 2 night schools.
So on January 21st, we're having a night school on police unions, and racial capitalism. It's going to be led by Femi Taiwo, Stuart Schrader, and Nell Geiser. And then on February 22nd, we're going to have labor journalist Sarah Jaffe talking about the topic of her book that coming out very soon called Work Won't Love You Back, on February 22nd.
And please visit us online at mdcdsa.org/night school. If you're not in DSA and you're inspired to join by our night school, please, please, please do so. I know these night schools attract a lot of people who have never been to a DSA meeting. And we're also having our general body meeting on Sunday, and I'm not sure what time that's at. And we're also on Twitter at, what are we on Twitter at, David? At nightschool_DC. Thank you again. And if that's everything.
Can I say something? Just because there's a few things here. I know we have to go, but someone said that the women eliminated revolutionary machismo. Yes. So one of the points of the Young Lords was machismo must be revolutionary. And the women who had signed on to that point were like, this is insane. How can machismo be revolutionary? So that was part of the gains of the struggle. They changed that point around sexism and they redrafted it. But at core, part of what the women brought to the organization, which was not particular to the women, but to the period, and it was influenced by the Cuban Revolution and the writings of Che Guevara, is the notion of the revolution within the revolution. That we have been socialized under a system that alienates us from ourselves and that produces racism, oppressions of all kinds, homophobia, the gender binary. And just because we're revolutionaries doesn't mean that we are not engaging in, and that we haven't been influenced by these ideologies. And so part of the process of the revolution, and this is not particular to the 60s. I mean, I think the Russian revolutionaries talked about the ways in which struggle helps us get rid of the muck of the ages. But it's not just struggle, it's struggle and the re-education of people in the revolutionary tradition.
I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you so much, everyone. This was a really great presentation. It's always a great time at night school. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Pick up the book.
Yes.
The Young Lords of Radical History. And tweet about it.
We'll tweet out. Is there a preferred place you want people to get it from, like an independent bookstore or something?
Well, you can get it from the I can send you a 40% discount. Actually, it's there, just UNC.
Okay,
Just go to the University of North Carolina Press, type my name, and the 40% discount is there right now.
we'll tweet out the link to this.
Yeah. Okie doke. Thank you very much.
All right, have a good one.
Thank you.